And so it's these SEPA reviews by SHPO that were the focus of the working group's activities. And in a few minutes, you will hear details about those activities, about the working group's review, about SHPO's review process, and some of the recommendations that were talked about. But that just kind of sets the stage for how we got here. And one brief tangential comment that we were asked to speak to. There is also a different law called the Connecticut Environmental Protection Act, which coincidentally has the same acronym. But I think it's SEPA is usually used with the Policy Act, and this is allows individual citizens to bring a court action or intervene in a proceeding to stop an action that they believe will significantly harm the environment or lead to unreasonable destruction of historic property. And SHPO is also involved in the Protection Act. And I think during the working group, we heard some testimony from municipal officials who had some interaction with that process and commented how people from all over the country had commented on the action and whatnot. But those are Protection Act actions and not Policy Act actions. The Policy Act is about, state agencies going to do something, or they're going to fund a project. And so the Policy Act speaks to the reviews that state agencies have to oversee. And so the Protection Act was not part of the working group's charge. And now to make some introductory comments about the working group, I will turn it over to my colleague, Sarah Leeser.
So we were also asked to just give a little bit of background about how the work group came to be. So as you probably remember, last session, this committee held a public hearing on HB 6756, which sought to give municipalities the ability to appeal SHPO determinations. And the committee voted out that bill, but it was later amended to instead establish this working group to study SHPO's role in administering the historic preservation review process as it relates to SEPA, and recommend changes to the act and the regulations. The bill required that the work group study make recommendations on the historic preservation consultation process, including the review timeline, its steps, and the roles of those involved in it. And the group's charge also included examining the goals and outcomes of a historic review and recommending a process for municipalities to appeal SHPO's determinations that are made under SEPA on the renovation and rehabilitation of historic buildings or properties. So the work group began its work in the fall, and they held their final meeting in January. And among other things, it received information from SHPO about its current review process and heard testimony from municipal officials and others who have experience with SHPO reviews. The group also received research from OLR about historic preservation reviews in other states, including, for example, information about what triggers a historic review and approaches for handling situations when SHPO and an agency disagree as to whether a proposed action adversely affects historic properties or on the mitigation measures that SHPO recommended. And so now the work group's presentation will provide some more details about SHPO's review process and the working group's findings and recommendations.
Okay, before we go with the presentation, just as a request for, I'm not sure that all of us have physically received a copy of your report, OLR. I don't know if our clerk is, have you, perfect. Because I think importantly, I'll just highlight in terms of the issue, you'd scroll back, I think the page and the charge to the working group, right? So we as a committee charge the working group for the working group, the study to make the following recommendations. So as we look through the process, one, I want you to look at the report, or the findings from OLR. Two, I just encourage the group to look to make sure that we have addressed the issues to everyone's satisfaction. As we move forward, you'll hear from the report. We'll walk through it step by step so that we get to the point where we have heard the report, can contemplate it, and figure out our follow-up actions there. Okay, thank you. I think if you want to proceed now to the presentation.
Good afternoon, Senator Hartley, Representative Meskers, and members of the committee.
You're welcome to the hot seat.
Thank you very much.
You've been in it all, working group, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to share with you. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, sorry, joining the meeting. Can you let me in? I don't know if I was ever in, actually.
So as we go forward with the presentation, the anticipation is we'll make the full presentation, then do a Q&A for the committee members afterwards. So I just encourage you all, take a note, or if there are notative issues that arise, so that we get a good flow through, and then any of the questions of subsequent.
Okay. Apologies. There we go. Okay, thank you very much. My name is Jonathan Kinney. I am the State Historic Preservation Officer for the state of Connecticut and the Director of Operations at the SHPO within DECD. My role today is to provide you with sort of a high-level overview of the existing regulatory review process at SHPO and to answer any questions you have. So this first piece of the presentation, which I will be taking on, will be the environmental review process. I did add a slide that had a list of the members of the working group, if anybody wanted to see that, but I think you may have that. Okay. Okay, thank you. So I'll start with, sort of an introduction here and talk a little bit about why a recipient of state funding would have to come before SHPO or get referred to SHPO as part of that process. SHPO operates as Terry kindly said earlier, that we have review processes that fall both under our federal role and our state role. Both of those laws are what we call stop, look, and listen laws, which essentially require an agency to gather information and to consider their impacts on historic properties before moving forward. And one of the ways, and in addition to that, they gather this information on how those impacts are going to happen and whether or not there are measures that will be necessary to avoid, minimize, or mitigate those impacts to historic properties. Our federal review process, as was mentioned earlier, is called Section 106, and that falls under the National Historic Preservation Act. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm really going to focus on our state level review process, which is the Connecticut Environmental Policy Act. This final bullet on this particular slide is important because we adopt the process that we use for our federal reviews into this state SEPA process. And we do that because the terms and the procedure are well codified within that federal process. So we translate that into our state process, which you'll see in the coming slides. This is an overview of our review process in graphic form, essentially. You'll see that there are 4 steps, and at each step there is the possibility of sort of an off-ramp where you're done, you've complied with the regulatory process, or you move on to the next step. And you'll see that within step 1, which is known as initiation of consultation. Are you undertaking a project that has the potential to impact a historic resource? If you are not, you're done. There's no potential to impact a historic resource. So you've complied with the law and you get to, you can move on with your project. At step 2 is where we know that the project has the potential to impact a historic property, but we're going to find out first if there are any historic properties in that area that we need to be concerned about. If there are no historic resources present within that project area, another off-ramp, the process is completed. There's no historic resources present. If there are historic resources present within your project area, or you're going to be impacting historic property with your project, we're going to move on to step 3. And we're going to assess whether or not what you're proposing is going to impact that historic resource in an adverse way. Are you going to be adversely affecting that historic resource? If what you're going to be doing is not going to adversely affect that resource, say you're, for instance, if DOT is building a road, but there's no impact to the historic house that's nearby, they're in compliance and they are done with the process. They get to move forward with their project. The real focus of the work of the working group was on this final step, which is step 4, and that's resolving adverse effects. This is the smallest number of projects. You know, a very small number of projects get to this point, and I will go into those numbers in a little bit. But these are the projects where we're going to require a little bit more conversation and a little bit more consultation with the project sponsor or the sponsoring agency to determine exactly how we're going to resolve those adverse effects through some form of mitigation. So what to expect when you come into this process, the regulatory process with SHPO. It is, as I laid out in the steps earlier, it's a delineated sequential process that leads to a decision enabling a project to move forward. SHPO does not stop projects. We simply work with the applicant as they move through this regulatory process. So you're going to see that 85%, vast majority of our reviews are completed after step 2. There's no historic properties affected. The applicant would receive a letter to that effect and they can move on with their project. A much smaller number, obviously, will move on to step 3, where we may ask for additional information to find out exactly what those impacts to that resource are going to be. And most of those projects will conclude with a letter from the SHPO stating, while there is an effect, that it is not adverse. Again, that would conclude the SEPA review process as far as SHPO is concerned. And then we have the small number, less than 5% of our reviews that go to step 4, where there is an adverse effect finding. And these projects involve conversations with SHPO staff that would result in actions required to be taken by the recipient of the state funding in order to minimize or mitigate that historic loss. Who is ultimately responsible for compliance? It is the state agency as far as the Connecticut Environmental Policy Act goes. It's the state agency that would be administering the funding, permitting, or approval for the project. Some agencies do take the step to delegate the responsibility of going through the process to their applicants, but the agency itself is ultimately responsible for ensuring compliance and considering and incorporating the recommendations of SHPO. SHPO's role in that process is to review, comment, and consult with the project sponsor to get them to that point. And we will provide formal letters of consultation throughout that process to do that. And one thing I did want to note is that SEPA, the Policy Act, is not a SHPO-specific law. It is a larger statewide environmental law, and we are not the only agency addressing whether or not the activity can move forward or will have an impact on natural or cultural resources in compliance with the Act. DEEP, for example, or housing would also be reviewing the project pursuant to their own specialties. When will SHPO respond? So SHPO reviews projects on a first come, first served basis as they arrive. We typically try to get a letter of concurrence out to the project sponsor within 30 days of initiating that consultation, although many times it is faster than 30 days. Once a review request has been through that initial 30-day response period, anything that we've requested in addition to that will be reviewed as soon as it is received in the office. So now I really kind of want to dive in a little bit more detail to step 4, which is the resolution of the adverse effects. And how does this happen? Resolution of an adverse effect is essentially happens when all the relevant parties agree to the treatments, measures, or stipulations, otherwise known as mitigation, that offsets the historic loss resulting from the project. Consultation is critical in this piece. It's a conversation between the SHPO and the sponsoring agency, and often the project sponsor as well. And these stipulations, these requirements are often memorialized in an agreement document that concludes the process. What is mitigation? I'd like to talk a little bit about that. It is commensurate with the magnitude of the historic loss. These are sort of the principles we think about when we think about mitigation. Mitigation usually involves some or more of the following principles. Related to the historic resource being lost, the mitigation will provide a public benefit, and it will also occur within the community in which that resource is lost. The at this point in the process, we typically ask the project proponent to convey all possible and pertinent information about their plans, what they believe is feasible as far as alternatives go, and economic evaluations that could have an effect on what those mitigation requirements end up being. And I'm going to hand it off to David Corus to continue the presentation.
Great. Thank you, John. For the record, David Corus. I'm representing the working group. And I want to thank the co-chairs and the ranking members and the members of the committee, not just for being here today, but in particular to thank the co-chairs and the ranking members for the number of meetings that we had and keeping us on task and, truncating a process into a fairly limited amount of time to enable us to meet the statutory deadline of being here with some recommendations in February. I think you'll see that the membership of the committee was pretty diverse. Just so you all know, my background, I've represented municipalities and sometimes developers on projects, oftentimes interacting with SHPO. I've been the president of Stanford Downtown, deputy commissioner of DECD, planning and development director for the city of Bridgeport. So I've interacted with the office in a variety of different ways over the years, both from the inside and outside. And I think I want to just start off by saying a little bit about kind of what we heard and what we tried to address. I think John did an excellent job describing the process. And it's fairly straightforward, but there are some opportunities for it to create some uncertainty. And that's what we were hearing from either municipal project sponsors or redevelopment agencies or developers. And it's important to note, as was mentioned at the outset in terms of framing the conversation, we worked very hard to limit the scope according to the bill that was passed. So we did not talk about the Protection Act. We did not talk about many of the activities that SHPO does conduct, but really focused in on that sort of fourth step. What happens when you have a project that is the recipient of state funding that is deemed to have an adverse impact on a cultural resource within the state? What happens next? And as John described, there is then a negotiation between SHPO and the developer, or SHPO and the municipality, or SHPO and the funding agency about how to mitigate that adverse effect. And I'll just call attention to a few things that we heard where there was the greatest amount of uncertainty. One, around timeline. SHPO is very good at responding in a very limited amount of time for the vast majority of those projects. But if you get into a mitigation negotiation, it can drag on. And we had heard that concern from a lot of instances. We also heard a concern that there could be sometimes a difference of opinion between SHPO in terms of their objectives of what to do with a project versus third-party experts that had been hired by the project developer, and how do we rationalize those difference of opinion amongst experts. We also heard that oftentimes we're talking about weighing impacts to a community, and impacts to a historic resource may be trading off with environmental impacts, may be trading off with economic impacts, and a lot of uncertainty over how we weigh those, both within the context of how SHPO makes its decision around mitigation requirements, but then also how interdepartmental direction is given to a project when it may be conflicting. So those are the things that we tried to address as well as possible in some, I think, limited but strategic recommendations. And so, I think one of the things that we kind of talked a lot about and frankly struggled a lot with was the fact that the direct relationship between SHPO and the project is through the funding agency. And so there is not the mechanism for, if I'm a developer and I receive a grant from DECD, I don't have an appeal process or a mechanism to kind of push back directly with SHPO. The decision is actually through the funding agency, as is laid out with SEPA. And so there's a lot of different parties involved that need to be kind of aligned and working in the same direction. And so a lot of it really comes back to coordination with that sponsoring agency. This is kind of the meat of a lot of what we came up with, because oftentimes mitigation results in a payment, essentially a payment to compensate the state for the loss of a resource. And we talked a lot about how does that get determined? How does it get determined if it's if it's necessary? How does it get determined what that payment goes into? And so we heard from a lot of project sponsors, developers, municipal representatives that there was a lot of back and forth over kind of what that dollar amount should be. But then also there could be an additional onus on the project, developer to actually put that mitigation funds into service. So sometimes now they're being brought into kind of a separate initiative where the requirement may be to, put up historic information signage, and they have to do an RFP and hire consultants and implement that, which is, from some people's perspective, a distraction from achieving the project for which the state funding was intended to achieve initially. And so what we talked a lot about was that balance between cost and certainty and timeline. And where we ended up was that in instances where there is an adverse effect and there is a loss of a resource and there is a need for mitigation, that SHPO would continue to negotiate to identify a solution. And we find that when that has happened historically, that is often in the, $100,000 range. We found some that were in the $250,000 range. And the recommendation of this diverse committee was that there be a set dollar amount, so that if the project developer, municipality, recipient of state funding so chose, they could opt to pay in lieu. And they could say, listen, it is not worth the time to jeopardize the project and cost inflation, et cetera, to go through a lengthy back and forth. It may ultimately cost me a little bit less, but I'd rather take a slightly larger payment to create an off-ramp now to give me project certainty. And we talked a lot about what that dollar amount should look like. And as you can imagine, there was not 100% agreement, but there was a recognition that the dollar amount had to be high enough that it incentivized ongoing negotiation with SHPO, but not so high that it didn't jeopardize a project coming to fruition. And so where we ended up as a recommendation was that it would be 15% of the amount of state funding, not to exceed $750,000. So a very big state grant would be capped at $750,000, but for example, a $1 million state grant would be capped at $150,000. And so typically this would be more than the mitigation amount that is reached through negotiation historically, but it may balance out against time and uncertainty for some developers or project grant recipients. And importantly, that money, and we talked a lot about exactly how this would work, and there's certainly some details to be ironed out, but that money would be transferred to an entity who could implement a mitigation project, and the developer or the municipality's obligation would be done. By cutting the check for mitigation, their responsibility would be finished. And so they wouldn't have to be in the mix in figuring out how the mitigation efforts were actually achieved. Sorry, I'm not sure what happened here. Frozen. John, any advice? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay. We also talked a lot about, well, what happens if there's just entrenched disagreement and the grant recipient, municipality, developer, et cetera, does not want to continue to negotiate. You're at an impasse, thinks that the buyout is inappropriate because, maybe mitigation isn't necessary. We wanted to have a mechanism via the DECD commissioner to, essentially elevate this question. Now, interestingly, because of the way SEPA is structured, it has to be the sponsoring agency that makes that request. So again, it gets a little bit complicated because if I'm a developer and I'm a recipient of DECD money and I don't agree with SHPO, I need DECD to agree to appeal to the DECD commissioner with me. Maybe not super likely, but as you'll hear in a few moments, broader SEPA reform would be required in order to change that mechanism. We have a timeline in there, 15 days, and a pretty quick turnaround from the commissioner should it be elevated to that level. Another thing we talked about, which I mentioned, was kind of broader voices in the conversation. Maybe the community within which the project is located values economic development differently relative to historic preservation. And we talked about how can we engage a broader range of voices from the municipality within which the project is taking place into this discussion about weighing outcomes and impacts and whether or not they're adverse and how they should be mitigated, et cetera, et cetera. Ultimately, we determined in lieu of creating a whole new process and potentially layering on steps that could draw it out even further, the SEPA scoping process provides that mechanism. A developer or municipality could go through the scoping process that exists through SEPA as a way to engage the community in a participatory discussion that could give the sponsor agency a broader perspective on how that community weighs historic resource impact versus other community objectives, housing production, economic development, et cetera. And I think I don't want to speak on behalf of SHPO, but SHPO was a great, participant through this process. And I think we talked a lot about, and SHPO has given many assurances about the way in which they'll communicate through this process, the transparency with applicants and participants about how the steps will play out. I think as you've noted, we felt as though there were some things that were beyond our purview and more broadly critiques of SEPA rather than SHPO's role within SEPA. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Anne, who's going to talk a little bit about next potential steps for discussion after the work of this committee.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Senator Hartley and Representative Meskers and members of the committee. I come up last, but you save some of the hardest decisions till the end or recommendations to the end. One of the, I'll
So
start
just
by,
for the record, if
intro-
you could introduce.
yeah, that's what I was
if you
just
may.
going
Okay.
to, I'm going to start by introducing myself. I'm Ann Catino. I'm actually a lawyer in private practice with Hallard and Sage. I've been practicing law 37 years in the development field and working with a lot of developers to particularly transform inner downtown areas into productive reuse. I've also represented a lot of municipalities as they seek the challenges associated with these developments. And for 18 years now, together with Gary O'Connor, we have served as the co-chairs of the state's Brownfield Working Group. And the Brownfield Working Group intersects very well with what this working group's charge is. For years, our downtown areas have been plagued with underutilized, underproductive properties. Every town has an old mill or an old gas station that just sits idly by, graffiti-strewn walls, people unfortunately taking up habitat in them. We have tried, for working with the Commerce Committee co-chairs and the legislature for a long time, obviously, to transform those eyesores and really turn them back into productive reuse. And we've been successful. There are a variety of new brownfield programs. DECD has really taken the ball and run with it, with the grants programs, the loan programs. And so there's a lot of funding, liability relief, opportunities available to municipalities and to developers. what we're seeing now through the evolution of this process is that there is, and I come at it frankly from the outside looking in. I'll just say when you use the word SEPA, to me, it's always the Protection Act, because I'm on the outside dealing with the Protection Act as opposed to the Policy Act, which the agencies have to follow. And there is a rub in between the two intersections, between the Policy Act and the Protection Act, and the intersection between the two. And it does stymie the development of projects and adds costs largely unintended. And I think that that's where the recommendations that we're making really serve two purposes. One is to streamline the process. As David has mentioned, and it was mentioned earlier, what's always important to developers? Time, money, and uncertainty. You want to keep a project on schedule, on budget, and you want to have some level of certainty that you're going to reach the conclusion and satisfy your investors, satisfy the community, and develop the project. And so that is the overarching goal that we felt we were trying to achieve. And so the recommendations that we were making had tried to achieve those goals. And they're very important from the standpoint of due process and the standpoint of money, because a developer or a municipality can opt to pay to keep a project on track if it can't solve the mitigation problem. And there's the due process part where you make the appeal ultimately to the commissioner, not under the Uniform Administrative Procedures Act, but at least you get an opportunity to sit down with the decision maker. These are the types of projects that, even though that's the smallest number of projects that fall in category 4, they're actually the projects with the biggest bang for the buck. And they're the most notoriously well-known in the municipality. And most people want it to happen. And so our recommendations were based against that backdrop, trying to bring in a project on time with a reasonable cost and with some certainty, and getting everybody at the table, including the municipality, even the community leaders. Now, what could be done going forward if working within the confines of what the subcommittee and the working group within the subcommittee did, which is work within the existing statutes and the existing framework? I think it's a monumental step forward, frankly, because it's going to provide more certainty. It'll be a better approach. But these are, policies that the agency has acknowledged and would meet. Could you take all these policies and put them in a statute and in 22A-1B? Sure. Absolutely. You can engraft these into the statutes. Do you want to deal with a larger issue of the shortcomings of the statute? There's an awful lot in 22A-1B to, I think it's 1F, that applies universally to all agencies. That's actually part of the problem. Every agency does something different. There's little uniformity. While we may solve the problem today of dealing with SHPO and going up through DECD to the DECD commissioner, particularly with, say, brownfield projects or funding that DECD would have, you still are engaged in differing interpretations, differing applications in all of the different areas, all the different agencies, excuse me. So bringing uniformity to all agencies certainly would help projects as they move forward, particularly when there are private sector dollars involved. And we touched on the Protection Act. And the Protection Act does, 2020-19A and B, deal with historic resources of the state. And, people you say SEPA, people confuse the policy and the Protection Act regularly. We heard from a lot of folks at the committee who were conflating the two. But the Protection Act serves a purpose that seeks to, in the event that there is unreasonable destruction of the historic resources, it gives the the citizens of the state the opportunity to object and to go to court. Looking at the Protection Act and how 2019 A and B operate was beyond our scope, but it is certainly something that we heard quite a bit about as it slows down a project and can add costs. So, without not passing judgment whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, but that is something else that could be looked at and potentially evaluated going forward as to whether there is opportunity for improvement within the Protection Act. Finally, I think that it's been a long time since the Policy Act really has overall been scrutinized. It had its genesis in the early 70s. It was amended slightly once in the 80s, slightly once in the 90s. In 2002, there were some technical changes, and there may have been other technical changes along the way when DEEP went from DEP to DEEP. But there hasn't been an opportunity really to peel it away, as the National Environmental Policy and Protection Act have been evaluated over the years. So that's something else that could be looked at. I think that there's opportunities, as we've done such a good job under the leadership of this committee, of changing the landscape for our brownfields and making them a success. There's more that can be done. We heard a lot of stories about how costs get added to older mills, older facilities because of the SHPO process. I think the recommendations we made will go a long way in order to reduce those costs. But more can be done, and more can be done statutorily as well as at the agency and at all agencies. So with that, I think we're concluded in our presentation. Bobbing head, yes. We're open for questions.
Yes, I think we're open for questions. I will defer to my co-chair to start the ball, just because not everyone needs to hear me every time, so go ahead.
Well, thank you. And I just want to thank all of the presenters and all of the backbench people, not that they're backbench, but the other people who worked in order to bring this to us today. And quite frankly, to boil it down to the common denominator that we're trying to get at as we struggled really to stay focused here. And so and Anne, thank you very much for giving us the historical chronology here. So this act was passed in the 70s, and we had some amendments, you say 80s and 90s, and technical stuff in 02. So just by virtue of that time chronology, it suggests, and I think that the SHPO people probably feel and agree with this very closely, that it needs some updating, and that will be, I think, the next iteration of this as we try to make sense and clarify this from the agency standpoint, as well as its application. So I just want to maybe ask one general question, because I've had more than my opportunity of questions as we've gone through all of this. And it's important for all of my colleagues to have this opportunity while you're here, because once again, I appreciate your time. And, as I have pointed out in some of our other work groups, where we have this level of expertise participating on working groups, it's kind of like, folks are on the clock here. So I get that. But David and Anne and Jonathan, so we really are talking about this fourth step. We're talking about the fourth step. And so 3,000, cases come before you, but you're right down to the 5% of those cases. So that seems like so minimal. Any one of the three of you, please, or all three of you, tell me why this last smallest tranche is so very important. Because you would say, okay, this is just a small part of this. Why are we concerned?
I'll take a first stab at it. I think what you have to keep in mind is everything that receives state funding goes through this process. So that 85% that get filtered out early don't necessarily have anything to do with SHPO. They're not necessarily big projects. It's just everything that receives state funding. And SHPO is going through their SEPA required steps to check the box to ensure that they don't raise any warning flags. So that 5%, it's 5% of the total world, but that 5% really may be the only projects that you care about in terms of being the ones that are redeveloping old mills, that are creating new housing in a center of a downtown, that are demolishing a decrepit building that's been an eyesore for a generation. So I think the number is misleading because so much of that 85% is a technicality in the process. And it's the 5% that are almost all of the projects that you would all say matter.
And so if I can just follow on with that explanation, thank you. We've just initiated a program called CIF, Community Investment Fund. And that overall goal is to markedly move the needle in those communities which have, hitherto, for whatever reason, been in chaos, been in distress is probably maybe the best way. And so this would also apply to the CIF program.
Yes, Senator, that's correct. And we work very closely with the CIF group at DECD to review those projects when they come in to provide feedback as quickly as we can to them.
I think you're right, though, Senator, to say that the intersection between the state programs that you've created that are meant to achieve the biggest impact, the communities where you're trying to achieve that biggest impact, and step 4 of the process, there's a lot of overlap between those circles.
Yeah, and so sometimes we're working across purposes. I mean, that's my impression here. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And before, I do have to leave in like 1 minute here, but thank you, all of you, for what you've done here. I do have a quick few questions. So is there something that we can do, Dave or John, regarding this requirement that this box needs to be checked off? We're talking about 85% of the projects. It's a requirement that we've statutorily that we've did back in, I don't know, 1970. So is there something that can be done? And that's just, you don't need to answer that for me now, but it's food for thought for the committee here. That out of that 85, what's the duration of the average duration of time from having to check that box off? 85% of these projects get nothing. No, there's no requirement done. What's the timeline?
That would typically be 30 days
30 days,
or
okay.
approximately 30 days,
And
yes.
one that baffles me the most. Just 2 other questions. So do you follow the federal guidelines when we established these, our guidelines, right?
Yes.
So did we add to the federal requirements? Or are they the same?
No, we use that's a great question. Thank you. We use the federal steps and review process for a number of reasons. The first being that quite often actually, we're seeing projects that are getting both state and federal funding. So we're using the federal process to ensure
No,
that.
I get that.
Okay,
And,
I'm sorry.
All right. My question is, did we add to the federal requirements
No.
in our state
No.
statutes? Okay, thank you.
Same process.
And last question that I have that really throws me is a developer or city agency. I know we had this discussion that they can simply, here's a check
Yes.
and pay that off. So why are we're borrowing money from the state. We've got this checkbox that we can actually get it checked off if we do something with that money, pay 750,000, whatever it is for a larger project. Why are we taking money away from the project? I just don't get that.
Well, At SHPO, we see our role as both protecting historic resources and also assisting these agencies as they go through this regulatory process and assisting them with their due diligence. And part of that is satisfying the requirements of SEPA, which they would need to do in conjunction with the state agency. And that state agency each state agency can do this differently, but they will take the recommendations of SHPO and move through that compliance procedure as they see fit. So we're assisting these agencies in meeting their compliance requirements. And by mitigating the historic loss with that payment, they're satisfying that requirement of SEPA.
I think about it this way, Senator, and it is a little odd. I'll give you that, right? The historic resource would exist, but for the project. The project is advancing because the state has given it money to enable it to advance. And so the state is saying, either through a portion of the state money or through a different pot of money, you need to make up for that loss of a resource with a historic positive within the same community. It takes a step back from the project and says, as close as possible, we want to be net neutral in terms of the historic character of the community. And because it was the state money that supported the project, which led to the loss, then we're going to put it towards the offset. But I can understand.
Okay, thank you. Feel my pain, right? I've got one, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Martin. So I'll grab back and then I'll pass it along. So one observation. So essentially in the 5%, we have one or two alternatives. A maximum cost of 15% supplemental and mitigation. And I guess, I don't know if we have a fair, accurate estimation and who could provide that with, is the standard operating procedure currently. That mitigation has only been in some cases. What's the average cost and how is that measured in the restoration of the property or preservation of essential items? We were in some disputes on issues that were pretty large magnitude, which would have automatically defaulted to 15%. So it's a two-part trick question. One of the questions is the time frame for that 5% generically. Like, how long does it take us to get to satisfaction? The second piece is like, what do we think, or do we have? And you're not charged, so it bothers me. You're not charged with the financial impact of the mitigation or remediation. Well, the remediation we're kind of defining, but getting to happiness and the restoration versus adaptive reuse. Do we measure the financial benchmarks of what's that going to cost? Because I understand I can get away with doing nothing with 15% payout. Am I averaging 10%, 8%, 7%? What kind of costing do we think we get? And have you monitored that historically? Because I know we're pulling these numbers out, but has that been the average?
You're asking if 15% is close to the average of the mitigation amount typically?
Or what is the average mitigation? What is not the mitigation amount, the average to successfully address your concerns for the 5%? What's the average incremental cost in the development? So I don't pay for mitigation. I work, I play, I get along, I get everything done. You're happy, we're happy. What's that generally running? What's the run rate cost on overage on the project?
I don't have a specific percentage available today, but I would say that it's probably substantially less than 15%, the average. 15% would be we selected that as the cap because that would be the ultimate highest amount that the project proponent would pay.
I think there's two separate answers. I think Jonathan's absolutely right. From what SHPO has conveyed to us, the typical mitigation payment is significantly lower than that. I think though part of what you're asking, Representative, is what is the cost implication to a project of avoiding the loss of the resource and avoiding the mitigation? And from my experience, that would run in the millions, right? You're usually talking about a multi-building complex and the developer wants to take down 2 of the 5 buildings. And SHPO's saying, well, those two are historically significant, so we'd love to see you rehab them. And the developer says, well, that will add millions of dollars to the project, so I'm not going to rehab them. I'm going to take them down. And then SHPO says, okay, in exchange for that loss of the resource, we're going to get a mitigation payment. And so I think right now, the ratio between the mitigation payments that SHPO gets and the money that the developer saves by going down the path where a resource is lost is pretty disparate, right? But I think my sense is the developer will be able to make that calculation pretty quickly upon the first conversation or two with SHPO and make a determination whether 6 months of potential negotiation around a mitigation solution that may ultimately cost $250,000 is or is not favorable to an immediate payout of 3/4. And I don't know that that's the right number. As you know, the committee struggled with this, and I don't think that there's really a science to exactly where it should be, knowing that it should be high enough to incentivize negotiation with SHPO, but low enough that it's actually a viable path for a developer without compromising the overall fiscal, likelihood of the project.
Okay, thank you. So I'll go back just in terms for the committee's sake, right? So the Community Investment Fund goes back now 3 years, I believe, or 2 years? Second year of disbursement, and I believe it's $150 million a year. And we, in our committee, upped the remediation from an annual budget of 25 to 35 million. Those are both resources, and this is why we're having the meeting in large extent going forward. The state is dedicating more resources to rehab, restore, remediate properties in historic areas of the state. The workload is going to increase. We want to make sure that the flow of the workforce is adequate, this resolution to the problems is high. So that's why this understanding of the concept and grabbing where we are today is essential for the committee. I'd like us to get, when we finish that conversation, that's why I want the questions forward. We want to have a resolute, virtually unanimous support for the recommendations to bring it forth to the floor we want the state to grow. We want to get these things moving forward in a constructive way. So I'm looking forward to other questions. Go ahead, Madam Chair.
I beg your indulgence, and I don't mean to cut off anybody in the line here, because I know Representative Cheeseman is next. But I just need to follow on with what David just said. So in that example, where the developer says, I need to take down these two buildings, and there's this, different sides, different opinions. In your experience, and David, without having this option, have you seen us lose development projects?
It's a combination of factors that are at play that end up with a failed project. And this is one that when the developers think about it and all of the variety of funding sources and all of the tentacles associated with funding sources, this could be a reason why they would move forward. They can't get additional private equity, private sources of funding to cover, the type of redevelopment that may be required to preserve those buildings as opposed to taking them down. There's only so much private funding available. And then when you think about what is the use, is it going to be retail, commercial, residential, and with potentially some additional requirements put on the types of residential, the costs all start to get squoze. That's not a word. They're squeezed. They get squeezed. So the developer can absolutely pull out, and they have.
And I think, Senator, to your earlier point, I think more than anything else, it creates this point of tension where the developer feels as though by receiving state funding through any number of grant programs like the ones you've mentioned, that they've basically been given the green light, right? The project has been endorsed, the project has been vetted, the project is moving ahead with state support. And then all of a sudden, they're in a realm of uncertainty where they're asking themselves, wait, actually, can I move ahead with this? Or what do I have to do to get to a point where I can move ahead with this? And I think, again, to your earlier point, it's about creating clarity and alignment of purpose so that we know that if a project is the recipient of state funding, we do want it to go forward, and we're not going to allow this to be an impediment. We still have to address the requirements of SEPA and acknowledge that there may be an impact to a resource, but the developer deserves certainty in knowing that they can find a path to that, and that's what this provides.
And I see Liz hand is up.
Okay, we want to recognize Liz.
Oh, sorry. It's Jonathan's mic. I'm Liz Shapiro. I'm the Director of Arts Preservation and Museums for the DECD. And I just wanted to, the CIF component, I think, is really important here because it speaks to when SEPA actually works well. So we have had no issues with any CIF funded projects because the applicants are receiving such good service and counseling through the CIF staff and Matt Puglisi, our deputy commissioner. So by the time they are presented to the council for approval or funding, we have already worked through all of those issues. So I just wanted to point that out. It's a very interesting situation because it directly reflects what we're talking about. When the sponsoring agency is doing the counseling well in the beginning, oftentimes there aren't problems because we've taken care of them in the beginning. So I thought that was sort of an important thing to note.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Cheeseman.
Thank you, Chair Meskers, and thank you, Liz, for your comments, because that was going to be one of my questions, given the CIF process. I know there were comments, I believe, at the last meeting from the governor's office that there was some concern that the projects being presented weren't, in effect, shovel-ready. So they were being awarded funds, they were going back 10 months later, we need more money because we've discovered that the costs have gone up. So I'm reassured to hear, certainly from the point of view of this process through which they need to go, you have worked out the kinks and they now know they're compliant. So just looking at the mitigation, I believe you said there could be a third party, let's say they opt to pay the fine, who would then perform the mitigation activities. One, give me an example of the third party, and two, how would they make the decision of, okay, we've lost this historic building or whatever, but this is what we're going to do to replace it? I'd be curious as to know how that process would play out.
Thank you, Representative. So I would imagine a developer who's received funding through one of our state agencies, housing, or, DECD, whoever it may be. You're talking about how that funding would be, the mitigation funding?
So
We
they,
talked about the mitigation funding going to an entity.
an
Yes.
entity, so it's gone to an
Oh,
entity.
it could
Example
vary.
of the entity,
yeah.
and how do they decide what the best way, because your examples, documentation study, informational plaque, other commitments to preservation, rehabilitation activities. And if the aim is to, we've lost this, but we preserved this, so it's sort of on equal footing. One, an example of the third parties who might administer this, and two,
Sure.
how they would decide this is an appropriate use of the mitigation funds to offset the loss that's been incurred by the development.
Sure. The third parties, it would vary from project to project depending on where the project was, but I could imagine it being either the municipality or a historical society or a local preservation group, perhaps, where we could, and we would have that conversation before the funding was transferred as to what the plan would be for that funding. So we'd have some idea in mind. I know we did one in I believe it was the south end of Stanford, where we had some mitigation funding that was transferred to a local preservation group, and they put together a small grant program for some residents. So it could be something like that. It could be given to the municipality for another preservation project that they might have in town, or to conduct a study on one of their municipally owned historic properties. So there's a lot of variety as to how that could work, but we would find an appropriate entity depending on what the intent was for the funding, I would think.
And I think obviously you would take into account the amount of the funds available, because certainly, you know, if it's a small amount, a small historical society might be in a perfect position to administer it. But if we're talking the maximum $750,000, you're obviously looking at someone who's going to be in a better position to administer and dole out those quantity of funds.
Certainly.
And another question, so we put in place this mitigation process, assume this goes forward. You mentioned that many of these developments may be receiving both state and federal dollars. Would this decision to go the mitigation route through a cash payment in any way jeopardize the federal dollars that may be going to that project?
It would, if they mitigated the loss, they will have satisfied their requirements pursuant to Section 106, which is the federal law as well.
So would, in effect, if the state says we're happy with this, the feds would say, okay, your processes are modeled on ours. We take your word for it that this is all kosher?
Yes, and we have had, and I want to confirm with staff, we have had federal funding received after state adverse effects. Yeah. Yes, we have had federal funding that has been provided to projects as soon as they've completed the state review process, or we've had something come in that had both at the same time initially.
And you're confident that this proposed new way to address the mitigation would not run afoul of any federal requirements?
No, not at all. No.
Okay. And final question, I think you mentioned the appeal process. The agency basically appeals to the agency commissioner, in which case you might be within the agency of DCD. You mentioned other entities who might be doling out funding, Department of Housing. So are there apart from housing, are there other departments within state government who are distributing these kinds of funds?
Yes, the SEPA applies to all state agencies and any funding or permitting that they're issuing. It varies on how that particular agency goes about complying with their SEPA process, but all state agencies are subject to it.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
But if I could just add, what we're proposing today only solves for one of the agencies essentially, not any of the rest. If it's coming through SHPO, that's the problem that we're solving for.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
I think that's a comment, a suggestion for another step for another day is what I'm hearing. I believe Representative Figueroa, if she's still on the line, she had her hand raised. I don't want to neglect in recognizing her.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a single question, and I just want to know as to whether we should, should the state be giving or allocating monies, before the plans are presented by the developers, just so that we could prevent, the sharing of any potential developers, coming up with any projects. So what I am taking out of this conversation is that perhaps monies are being given ahead before the plans are revised by any state agency. Am I correct by asking this question?
I think, Jonathan, I'll let you handle it. I think I'm on the same page, but you can go ahead.
Well, it's a great question. It's actually the state funding that triggers the review. So until the funding is in place, the review process doesn't begin. So I believe what she was asking was, are these projects vetted by the agencies ahead of the funding being granted?
Granted, yes.
Okay. I mean, that would be a question for the agencies, but as far as the SEPA review process goes, our review would not be triggered until that state funding was in place.
Yeah, based on the current regulations, as I understand it, Representative Figueroa, so the money, a developer comes, proposes a project to the municipality, the project requires both private sector funding and public sector funding in many cases, whether the public sector money could be a small portion thereof, 5%, 10%, 4%. So once the monies are secured, it triggers a requirement for a review of the state historic preservation laws, right? And SHPO gets involved at that point to then figure out if they, and as they suggested, 85% of the time that the money flows through the system, they don't care. Or there's no necessary mitigation. The project doesn't require anything. Yeah, or 95% of the time, I'm sorry. So 5% of the time, they think there's something of historic value there. So the developer is basically waiting as to whether or not to find out that there is a need that needs to be addressed from SHPO. So there's no way for the developer to know beforehand. Is that clear? Do you have a follow-up on that?
I would just add that there are instances, I believe, with our brownfields program and even CIF, where we are given the opportunity to review the applications ahead of time before the funding is in place, just to get ahead of those and to provide that feedback to the funding agency. So there are ways to sort of streamline that process where we're able to provide some advisory comments ahead of the funding being in place.
But that's specific on things where the state's involved in toxic soil versus redevelopment.
It's typically, it is, yes, that process arises from specific funding programs. That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Representative Figueroa, do you have a follow-up or are you okay?
I'm good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your answer.
My pleasure. Do we have any follow-up questions? Any further questions from the group? Representative Harrison. Ranking member, sorry.
Thank you. I sort of get into this weeds and a little more technical. So sometimes people come to you and they get a grant for, say, a study. Is this going to be, feasible? And they get that money. And then they determine based on that they're going to move forward. But perhaps to your point, they might get private investors or something. If they've completed the one piece of it, do you still have some authority over what they're doing, even if they received a small grant to that? Am I making sense? Okay.
You're asking if only a piece of their funding stack is public funding?
Mhm.
Yes, that would trigger a review because there is the use of state funding for that project.
But I think you're asking a little different question about
I think so.
phasing, right?
Oh.
Yeah,
What
phasing.
if there's state
Oh, a phase.
funding,
Okay, I'm sorry. I
state
misunderstood.
funding in an
Correct.
earlier phase for which there's no impact, and then there ends up being a subsequent project? Do you still have the process?
Correct.
We would be reviewing the phase, with the public funding. We do not typically review privately funded undertakings.
Okay.
Maybe protection.
Yeah, no,
I-
I hear what you're asking is, you've got a project that's phased. Right now, you're doing the exploratory piece
Correct.
of the project. Say like
Correct.
a phase one, and you go to DECD for a brownfield grant to
Mhm.
complete the phase one. There is no development yet. You just want to find out what.
Is
the
it
dirt
feasible
is. Is
to
it
develop
feasible?
it, or what are we facing to develop it?
Right, and so that's, I think, is the question is, what is your role when it's just really an assessment grant and you don't have a project?
So then,
And
then
if you have an exclusively privately funded
correct,
project,
based on what they
then
figured
there
out
would
in the
be
assessment.
no SEPA Policy Act
Correct.
implication.
Correct.
If there is a historic resource on that site that is impacted, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Protection Act could be
Potentially.
leveraged to protect that resource being jeopardized by the development, but it wouldn't be a Policy Act automatic review by SHPO because there would be no state money in those phases.
Okay, I just want to be clear. 'Cause
Yes.
I know that sometimes they're done in phases
Yep.
and
In fact, we just commented
funding
on,
comes
yep.
in phases.
Yes, we just commented on an assessment report on a brownfields property. And all we did was notify the municipality that the property was in fact historic, so that they know if they go forward with any phase of work that we would be having a conversation in the future.
Okay, and that would mean even if they had got funding from you or they got private funding.
Only if they received state funding would it trigger SEPA.
Okay, so they
Yes.
they could move forward, but it would not be under the policy, it would be under the other act. Understood. Thank
Yes.
you.
Go ahead, Representative. Question?
I believe you already answered this, but just for clarification. So if it was privately funded, you wouldn't be involved. What if it's federally funded? And,
Yes.
but not state funded?
Yes,
But
we have,
federally funded, would you still be required?
we have a separate process for federal undertakings. Yes.
Okay.
There's a federal review process.
Okay, so only if it's privately funded, you wouldn't, but even, okay,
We do not typically review private
Yeah.
funding. Yeah, correct.
okay, thank you.
Unless it falls under the other act.
Well, the other act, under the Protection Act, doesn't compel any regulatory review by either a state or a local agency. What the Connecticut Environmental Protection Act does is it provides a mechanism for a private citizen in the event the private citizen alleges that there is unreasonable destruction of the historic structure, whatever it is, to go to court and make that claim. And that ultimately leads to a negotiation with a municipality, with the person who's bringing the suit, in order to solve, how do you fix this so that people aren't going to court?
And just to be clear, and the state through the AG's office could exercise the Protection Act as well.
Absolutely.
Right, so.
Correct.
So.
You gotta talk.
Yeah, sorry. So if it's just a privately funded project, there would be no automatic SHPO review. But if a member of the public or the public through the AG's office think that the loss triggered by that private action is so extreme, that the Protection Act provides the court-based process to challenge that.
And does that court-based process take us back to SHPO?
No,
Not necessarily.
yeah, not
So
necessarily.
there'd be a third party deciding on the mitigation or the resolution of the issue.
They would just block the act.
They would block, well, the
Yeah,
court,
they seek
has the
injunctive relief
option.
essentially.
Yeah.
there's a lot of, all of the remedies that would be available in court could be what the judge could evaluate.
evaluate.
Either don't tear it down or mitigate somehow. There are a variety of options available.
Okay, thank you. Senator Hartley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, so Jonathan, you are the feds?
What's up?
You are the feds?
Am I the feds?
Yes. In other words, you're doing.
Yes.
Yes.
We do wear a Fed hat,
Sit-
yes.
Sitting right in
correct.
front of us, we've got the feds here. Okay, all right. So just to
I
clarify.
thought you asked me if I was on the fence and I didn't know
No,
about what.
Not feds, not feds. I said feds. Yeah, okay, just so that we know what we're talking about. All right, so you've got that whole other responsibility and designation.
Yes.
Within. Okay, without getting into, the nuance of the description in the statute, can you just generally define historic resource for the committee? Because we keep talking about historic resource. What is a historic resource?
Yes, so we operate with two different definitions. One of those is federal and one is the one that's used in SEPA. And I have them actually both here, but I'll try to ad lib them. The federal definition is essentially a building, district, site, object, or I'm missing one, structure that is significant in American history or a number of different categories that is eligible for or listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The state definition is slightly different. I believe it refers to historic landmarks, and I believe Terry pulled this up earlier. Let me just find the actual definitions. I have them. Okay. The state definition is I'm sorry. Building, structure, object, or site significant in American history, architecture, archaeology, and culture, or property used in connection therein, including sacred sites and archaeological sites. The national definition is a historic property is a district, building, structure, site, or object that has been listed or is considered eligible for listing on the National Register.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of shed some definition that's
Certainly.
tangibly around that, yeah. And if I might, so we spend a lot of time talking about the mitigation and the 5% and so forth. What we didn't talk about is the scenario where we have the developer who hasn't taken the off-ramp, but has a distinct position which is different from SHPO. What is the process for that developer for reconciliation? We're not talking about off-ramp now, we're talking about appeal.
So first, let me make a distinction. I think by having the off-ramp in a payment for mitigation, I think you remove the right to challenge the amount, right? It's either the off-ramp amount or it's the negotiated amount. But I do think what we allowed for was to challenge whether or not mitigation is even required, whether or not the action results in a loss of a resource that necessitates mitigation. And correct me if this is wrong, but my understanding is let's use a concrete example. I'm a developer. I received a grant from the Department of Housing, and that is the only state entity or federal entity that I received a grant for. And I disagree with SHPO that the building that I'm going to build is going to result in a loss of a resource. I would have to convince the commissioner of the Department of Housing to, through SEPA, approach the commissioner of DECD to challenge the determination that there's a loss of a resource that requires mitigation. And then there's a timeline in here that that challenge would have to be made within 15 days of SHPO's determination that there was a loss requiring mitigation. And then the DECD commissioner would respond within 30 days. But you have to convince the funding agency to essentially make that appeal, because through SEPA, there is no direct relationship between the entity receiving the funding, be it a developer or a municipality, and SHPO. The relationship is between them and the agency that funded them, and between the funding agency and the SEPA review agency in SHPO. Hence the call for some potential broader reform.
Right, so theoretically, let's say we're talking about something with a brownfield, in the brownfields program, you might have a situation where a part of DECD, a bureau, whatever it is, appealing to their commissioner. So they're appealing essentially to themselves, which is awkward on the optics of it, but also the actual practicality, right?
Yeah, and I'll be honest, right? Having been in the commissioner's suite, that's what happens now, right? Developers come to the commissioner's office to try and get a broader context and understanding for what they're hearing from SHPO or other entities. And so this, while a little bit odd, it's also kind of formalizing and clarifying what is now taking place on a much more informal and ad hoc basis. It's a step.
Sorry. With regard to what's happening now and what, we are contemplating, you don't think that we need any other process which would give a direct lane to the developer and to the commissioner in this instance, who is deciding, making the ultimate decision?
Personal opinion,
Yes.
I do think we need something like that, but that was outside of our purview because that is not controlled by SHPO's role within SEPA. That is controlled by the overarching policy act. And if we change it for SHPO, we're changing it across the board into how the act plays out in a lot of other ways as well.
And I'd just like to add, it would be a,
That's the remedies.
it would be a
statutory
statutory change that would also be applicable to all agencies.
yes.
So there would be a Uniform Administrative Procedures Act process in every agency where there would be an appeal to the commissioner of that agency for those adverse determinations. Does every agency have that process in place right now? I don't think so. I don't think so. DEP certainly does. They have, through their permit process and order process, there is mechanisms by statute where you appeal. You take what's called special exceptions to the commissioner when you have adverse rulings. Those are all prescribed by statute. If we were going to do that, even though it's awkward, it goes to the commissioner, but that's the process. If we wanted to do that with the Policy Act, that would change uniformly to all agencies. And, I'll just throw out there's a cost associated with it. There's time associated with such an appeal under the UAPA, but it's a process that would work. But it's time and it's money, and it really opens up the process. The other aspect is, and I know Connecticut has discussed it, the legislature has discussed it, do you create, a uniform hearings office that becomes the Office of Adjudications for all agencies? So it's another, mini little adjudicatory office that hears all sorts of appeals, all sorts of administrative decisions. That would be a radical change in the state, but that is another process that could follow where all appeals go right to this Office of Adjudications.
And that could fit under the umbrella of this conversation we're having about this 1971 Act, which needs to be updated.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. That could be part of the conversation as to, does this work? Does this make sense going forward?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. T.
I would like to think of that less as an adjudication office than a new 311 number. I find in my dealings with agencies many times it's an interesting relationship as a state representative, and I can't imagine what it'd be like to be a constituent. So I think the process for that reconciliation and adjudication is important within the agencies, within the government, within the executive, because it seems to be going all the way to the head of the executive office, which I think ties up a lot of administrative time. Jonathan, I have a question. I'll go back to I want to understand the process. I'll go back to the rather famous Windows conversation of past, right? And it's not because it's not because of that conversation. It's a process question, right?
Mhm.
So we move forward with a 15% get out of jail free card. I'm going to be relying on the good faith of the agency in mitigation that we don't identify the restoration as being the most expensive alternative to often to ultimately trigger the mitigation fee versus the adaptive reuse or repurpose. So it's not, to go back to that, I'm just trying to figure out, I want to make sure that the decisions are in good faith within the agency to get people to work together to do stuff versus, because the other alternative is to sit there and say, I'm going to find the highest mitigation or the highest price to, because I would like to see enough suitable restoration versus mitigation. So I want to make sure that there's good faith on both sides. I think that's imperative. And I think the second piece that I'm trying to wrestle with is the issue of the agency flow through in the appeals process. I think, as we mentioned, I understand that where we are now in terms of the resolution, but I'm not sure that if my appeals stay within the agency and I don't even get to be the appellant as the builder, it's problematic to make sure that the voice is adequately represented for resolution. I think those are things, I find that I have I had an issue with a constituent with the Office of Policy Management who applied for a grant. And I thought it was a meritocracy, and the response back was, you missed a couple of boxes, you've been rejected, and the process is over. It's like, it's like, I would be very happy if they failed on on the merits of their application. But we do things within the agency world that requires us to figure out that appeal process. So, you know, we're going to take it under advisement now and know that that's probably one of our considerations, that you guys get that. And lastly, I think what my other concern that I don't think is adequately addressed or substantial yet, I don't know the measurement of opportunity loss. And more importantly, like, how many people come into the office and then run away? So it's a question of lost opportunity with development, and you know, for that 5%, because as we begin to dedicate more resources to whether it's remediation, you know, if we're going to be successful in the next couple of years, you and I are going to be wrestling every day because there's going to be cranes all over the state. And as those cranes do development, you're going to care. You're going to be telling me I'm taking things down. I'm going to say, no, I want to improve. And I want to make sure the wrestling process is healthy. So I'm hoping that you and I have those conversations almost every day because of new projects. So I just wanted to, I think measuring what projects don't get done is at some level. I'd like you guys to think about how do we figure out where we drop dead. I mean, the last time with the conversation we had was not related to this project, but it was one with the building, the famous Grange building.
Mhm.
And that was a failure at some level, but I don't know that it's measured as a failure for both of us. There is no building there. There's a plaque. I don't think anybody, that wasn't where we wanted to go. I think
course not.
measuring that, it helps us with our process. So that's what I'd like us to make sure we measure, so that your side, your process that we all voted for and support, yeah, it's successful. So,
Yeah, and I would just add to that, you know, I welcome those conversations because there's no one in the state that wants to see these old buildings rehabilitated and put back into service more than SHPO.
Good.
That is our ultimate goal. So anything we can do to make our process more transparent, make our process more usable, we welcome those comments, and we really believe that the recommendations, the proposals we're making here today will help reduce the risk of the unknowns as far as cost and time, and you know, just overall improve the customer service experience with SHPO.
Well, I have to tell you I couldn't be more in agreement. I think the level of cooperation, the nature of the meetings, the constructive dialogue, the highlighting of where we are, what we need to get to. I couldn't have been happier with the response, and you know, I salute you on that. At some point, I'll be talking about OPM about the application process for grants, but I really appreciate where we've got to on this. So thank you.
Thank you.
And just throw it over to my co-chair.
Yeah, thank you. No, I just want to go back to something that Ann said, and that was about, you know, blue skying here, you know, adjudications office. Could that not be funded on a fee basis by the applicants, those we're appealing? You talked about the money. I mean, we're very conscious of money. I happen to sit on appropriations, and so it's always hanging on me.
Blue sky. If someone wants to take an appeal from an adverse ruling of an agency, there could be a fee associated with that. It makes you pause as to whether or not I really want to take this appeal and lose, because I could always lose. Is it worth the money? There are also oftentimes with permits and even going, you know, through the transfer act and remedial properties, you know, there is the pay as you go concept. There are advantages to it, but that is a way to defray a cost to, you know, blue sky and Office of Adjudications, is have whoever would be taking the appeal have a fee associated with taking the appeal.
You mentioned deep right now that what's their construct?
They don't have a fee for taking an appeal. If I have an adverse decision on a permit or a positive decision on a permit, and, you know, I'm the neighbor and I don't want it, you don't have to pay a fee in order to go to the Office of Adjudications and have it heard, or even then file special exceptions to the commissioner. There is no fee. But they've got a very specific statutory and regulatory process.
Thank you.
But if
Thank-
you want to create something all new, you could have a fee.
That's a TBC, huh? All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions from the committee? Representative Harrison.
One more just for clarification. You gave us the timeline for SEPA here in the state of Connecticut. So the 70s, a little bit in the 80s and 90s, and then 2002. Have there been updates federally? And what's the timeline for that one?
To the federal review process, section 106, yes, it is updated periodically. I don't remember when the most recent update was, but it was definitely within the 2000s. So it is regularly updated.
So we're a little behind them.
Definitely.
Okay, thank you.
Well, so the temperature seems to be going down in the room as well. So I'm going to draw the meeting to a conclusion. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you for presenting us with the study. And to our clerk, that both the presentations or all the presentations have been circulated, I think, by now. Okay, thank you.
I'm so sorry and pardon me. No, so next step is we will be drafting a piece of legislation which will come before this committee, and you will have another opportunity at a public hearing to opine. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you all. That concludes our meeting.